Welcome to Sleepytime History. True stories from the pages of history for a full night's rest. If this is your first time listening, let us know where you're tuning in from, or make a request for a future episode. And if you like what you hear, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps us immensely. All right, it's time to settle in, relax, and take a wander through the pages of history and storytelling. Tonight, we're going to be exploring the remarkable true story of Alexander Selkirk, a Scottish sailor and privateer who found himself marooned alone on a deserted island for over 4 years. His extraordinary tale of survival is widely believed to have inspired Robinson Crusoe, the iconic castaway in Daniel Defoe's classic novel. Selkirk was not born for quiet shores. In the late 1600s, as the world of maritime exploration, trade, and privateering surged across the Atlantic and into the Pacific, young men with restless blood and a hunger for something beyond the familiar took to the sea. Selkirk was one of them. Headstrong, impulsive, and drawn toward danger like a moth to flame. In 1703, he signed aboard the Cinque Ports, a privateering vessel bound for South America, part of a rickety flotilla skirting the edge of legality as it preyed on Spanish treasure ships. But tensions flared, and when the ship dropped anchor near a lonely island off the coast of what is now Chile, Selkirk made a fateful decision. He demanded to be left behind, believing the ship too unsound to sail. Whether it was stubborn pride or sound judgment, his shipmates granted his wish and sailed away. He would remain there for 4 years and 4 months. It's a tale of quiet adaptation, of learning the rhythms of the land, the language of solitude, and the strength of silence. Selkirk not only survived, he endured with dignity, building a life as complete as the island would allow. Tonight, as we drift into sleep, we reflect not on the isolation of that experience, but on the way Selkirk came to know himself within it, how the stillness of a faraway island revealed an unshakable resilience, and how that long silence continues to echo in stories of adventure and survival to this day. So settle in, take a deep breath, and let's journey softly now, step by step, through the quiet island days of Alexander Selkirk, a castaway not lost, but found in the heart of solitude. The sea breeze that swept through the village of Lower Largo carried with it the salt of distant horizons, and on certain days, when the tides shifted just so, young Alexander would find himself staring out across the Firth of Forth, not at what lay before him, but at what might lie beyond. Born in 1676 to a family of cobblers and tanners, Selkirk had little reason to believe his life would be anything other than ordinary. But something stirred within him, a restlessness, quiet but insistent. He quarreled often, not just with his brothers, but with local authorities too. Sharp-tempered and stubborn, Alexander was no stranger to the feel of discipline or the disapproving eyes of the Kirk session. And so, while many of his peers chose trades and steadiness, Alexander looked instead toward the open sea. It was a time of privateers, men who walked the fine line between sanctioned plunder and piracy. The oceans were alive with opportunity and peril, especially for those willing to serve under a captain's flag in search of Spanish silver or foreign spice. For Selkirk, it was a chance to leave behind the cold stone streets of home and chase something he couldn't quite name. Glory, perhaps, or maybe just freedom. In 1703, when word came that a new privateering expedition was being outfitted in England, Alexander signed on without hesitation. The venture was backed by the English crown, given leave to prey upon Spanish ships in the name of Queen and country. It promised danger, yes, but also the kind of open skies and endless water that called so deeply to men like him. The ship was the Cinque Ports, a modest vessel crewed by rough hands and ambitious minds. Its companion was the Saint, George, commanded by the renowned and often polarizing Captain William Dampier. Together, these two ships would sail from England down along the west coast of Africa, around Cape Horn, and into the vast Pacific. Their mission: disrupt Spanish trade, take prizes, and return home laden with riches. But that was the map on paper. The reality would prove far more complicated. As the Cinque Ports creaked into the swell of open waters, Selkirk stood at the rails, hair tangled with salt, eyes scanning the pale horizon. He was not yet a castaway, not yet a legend, not yet the man he would become. For now, he was simply a sailor with a restless spirit, aboard a ship bound for glory or ruin, perhaps both. The journey had begun, and with it, a quiet unraveling, one that would lead, step by patient step, to the solitude of an island, and a place in the quieter corners of history. The sails of the Cinque Ports unfurled like pale wings against the morning sky, catching the wind with a low, contented sigh. Beneath them, the ship groaned softly, her timbers old, her hull weathered, yet eager to move forward. It was late in 1703, and the voyage had begun in earnest. Selkirk, now a sailing master aboard the vessel, kept his thoughts guarded and his eyes open. He wasn't new to the ways of the sea, but this voyage felt different. The mood was taut, held between ambition and unease. Aboard the St. George, Dampier's reputation loomed large. A brilliant navigator, yes, but erratic and given to grim moods. The Cinque Ports sailed under the command of Thomas Stradling, a young captain eager to prove himself, though still green in experience. The two men did not see eye to eye, and their crews soon mirrored that friction. The journey southward was long, hugging the African coast before making the treacherous run around Cape Horn. There, in the southernmost latitudes, the two ships were battered by cruel winds and towering waves. The ocean grew iron-grey and merciless, masts strained, rations spoiled. Men clung to ropes with numb fingers, praying through clenched teeth. It was during these weeks of struggle that Alexander began to notice signs, small, almost forgettable moments that spoke of trouble ahead. The Cinque Ports was taking on water more often than it should. Her seams leaked, her hull moaned. Repairs were constant, patching up the wounded vessel with tar and prayer. And yet the voyage pressed on. Once around the Horn, the Pacific opened up like a vast sigh. Warmer winds, calmer seas, and yet no less dangerous. Spanish settlements dotted the South American coast, and privateering now began in earnest. The crews captured a few ships, though not nearly the prizes they'd hoped for. There were quarrels over shares, whispered complaints about the fairness of command, and frequent illnesses that spread through the hammocks like fog through the rigging. Alexander, for his part, remained diligent. He took no joy in the politics of the expedition, but watched it all carefully, quietly. Stradling grew more irritable. Dampier grew more distant, and all the while the ship beneath them creaked, not with life, but with quiet warnings. By the time they reached the Juan Fernandez Islands, a lonely cluster of volcanic peaks off the coast of Chile, the Cinque Ports was in a poor state. Her provisions were low. Her hull had been weakened further. Men grumbled in the shade of canvas sails, exhausted and thin. And there, on the shore of one particular island, known then simply as Tierra, Selkirk made his fateful decision, one not born of rashness, but of careful calculation, perhaps even foresight. But for now, the Cinque Ports rocked gently in the bay, the sea calm, the island quiet. No one yet imagined how far this detour would echo. The morning was still, the sky a soft wash of pale blue, as the Cinque Ports floated at anchor just off the coast of Tierra. The island itself rose out of the sea like something half forgotten. Steep cliffs cloaked in green, trees swaying gently in the warm breeze, and the distant sound of waves folding themselves onto an empty shore. Alexander stood at the water's edge, his boots damp with sea spray. Behind him, a quiet standoff was unfolding. After months of hardship and failing rigging, Selkirk had grown certain of one thing. The Cinque Ports was no longer seaworthy. The hull, he believed, had been too poorly repaired, and the ship, pushed hard and mended often, would not survive another leg of the voyage. He made his case to Captain Stradling, firmly, repeatedly, and when his warnings went unheeded, he made an extraordinary demand. He asked to be left behind. At first, the crew laughed. No man in his right mind would choose exile, even temporary, over the thin hope of reaching richer shores. But Selkirk was resolute. He'd rather survive alone than perish in another storm, or sink beneath Spanish cannon fire. Perhaps he thought his protest would force Stradling's hand, make the captain reconsider the ship's condition. But if so, it backfired. Stradling, annoyed and prideful, granted Selkirk's request with cold finality. Supplies were gathered, a musket, some powder, a cooking pot, a few tools, clothing, bedding, and his cherished Bible. Then, with little ceremony, he was rowed ashore. Selkirk watched as the boat pulled away, the oars dipping rhythmically, growing smaller with each stroke. He may have expected, or at least hoped, for a change of heart, that someone would shout, wave, return. But the sea remained quiet. The Cinque Ports raised anchor that afternoon, her sails filling with the light breeze. Selkirk stood on the sand as the ship that had carried him across oceans slipped out of sight, leaving him with only the whisper of waves and the shifting cries of seabirds. In that moment, the enormity settled upon him. The island was beautiful, yes, fertile, rich with wild goats and cool springs, but it was also silent. There would be no trade winds, no friendly ports, no voices but his own. Days would be measured not in bells and watches, but in sunrises and seasons. At first, he made camp near the shoreline, building a simple shelter with palm branches and driftwood, but the nights brought strange cries from feral cats, and rats nipped at his stores. He moved inland to higher ground, where the breezes were clearer and the land more defensible. In his earliest days alone, he felt the weight of regret like a stone in his chest. The choice had been his, a sober, reasoned one, but the consequences were harder to carry. Still, each morning brought light, and with it, something like resolve. Selkirk began to walk the island, to learn its shape, its offerings, its dangers. He listened, he watched, he waited, and somewhere inside him, the sea's restlessness began to change, not into stillness, but into something quieter, something steady. The island was green and rugged, rising steeply from the sea, like a ship frozen in time. It was about 15 miles long, a cradle of volcanic stone and soft winds, dotted with dense woods and hidden streams that ran cool and clear through the underbrush. Selkirk, now alone on this forgotten shore, woke each day with the soft stirrings of nature, the rhythm of ship life, the bells, the calls, the clatter of deckwork was gone. In its place, there was only the hush of trees swaying gently, the chatter of birds unseen, and the slow, steady lap of waves against rock. Those first days were marked by a strange quiet, not just the absence of people, but the absence of direction. Selkirk had been cast ashore with a musket, a small cache of powder and shot, a hatchet, a knife, a Bible, and some bedding. He set about building a shelter along the beach, something simple but serviceable. Branches lashed together with twine made from bark, thatched over with broad leaves. A place to sleep, a place to think. But the shoreline proved less hospitable than it seemed. The rats, descendants of those left behind by old Spanish ships, came at night, bold and persistent. Feral cats stalked the shadows, their eyes catching the moonlight. Selkirk's food stores were not safe, nor was his sleep. He soon realized he would need to move inland. Carrying what he could, he ventured higher into the island's heart. There, he found groves of pepper trees and cabbage palms, and hills where wild goats roamed freely. These goats, likely left by earlier explorers, became his lifeline, providing milk, meat, and hides. With careful patience, he learned to stalk them barefoot across the island's slopes, fashioning snares from vines and eventually running them down with practiced skill. Fresh water was plentiful, and wild turnips, berries, and coastal herbs filled out his diet. In time, the land revealed itself as both generous and demanding, a place where every comfort had to be earned. Selkirk fashioned tools from stone, hollowed tree trunks into cooking vessels, and repaired his clothing with needles made from bone and thread pulled from his own garments. He tanned goat hides for new shoes. He reinforced his inland shelter with heavier timber, carving a cave-like refuge against the rains and winds that swept through during storms. At night, he read aloud from his Bible, not for salvation perhaps, but for the sound of a human voice, even if it was only his own. The verses gave rhythm to the silence, something to hold on to when the vastness of solitude pressed close. He kept count of the days by notching marks into wood, though over time the tally lost its urgency. There was no clock to keep, no ship to wait for, just the slow passage of light and shadow, growth and decay. He was alone, but not undone. And in those first quiet weeks, as the routines took hold and the panic faded, something unexpected began to settle in. Not peace exactly, not yet, but a kind of understanding that life here would not be measured by the noise of ambition or the chatter of crowds, but by the quiet skill of endurance. The island had once seemed vast and unknowable, a wild place of steep ridges, tangled forests, and unfamiliar sounds in the night. But as the months passed, Selkirk began to chart it, not with maps or compasses, but with memory, instinct, and the slow, patient tread of repetition. He learned where the goats grazed and where they drank, tracking their movements through the dew-soaked grass before dawn. He would rise early and move barefoot, quietly, blending into the land. Over time, his pursuit sharpened, and with it, his self-reliance. He no longer relied on his dwindling gunpowder. Instead, he caught the animals with hand-fashioned snares, or outran them on foot, a feat made possible by the tough leather shoes he had crafted from goat hide and sewn with bone needles. From their skins he made garments. From their meat he dried strips of jerky beneath the sun. The goats became not just a source of sustenance, but of rhythm. Their presence gave each day structure. Something to do, something to prepare for, something to carry forward. Shelter, too, evolved. The makeshift lean-tos of his first days gave way to more permanent dwellings. He built 2 huts on a gentle rise overlooking the wooded interior, one for sleeping, the other for working and storage. Their walls were made of woven branches, reinforced with clay and lined with hides to keep the wind out. The roofs were thatched thick with palm leaves. A bed of soft grass and woven mats made his rest more comfortable. He began to collect useful stones, shaping each of them into knives, hammers, and grindstones. In time, he even crafted a simple chair and table, not out of indulgence, but out of need for structure and dignity. He wasn't just surviving now. He was living, shaping a life that suited the landscape, rather than fearing it. Wild turnips, cabbage palms, and pepper berries formed the bulk of his diet, seasoned with what herbs he could find along the shore. He learned to preserve his food with smoke and sun, timing his preparations to the patterns of rain and wind. Rainwater was collected in hollowed logs and coconut shells. His cooking pot, among the few items left to him from the ship, remained one of his most valued possessions. He became his own physician too. When ill, he turned to native remedies, roots brewed into teas, berries chewed for strength. There were stings, cuts, fevers, and deep aches that passed with time and patience. Each small recovery felt like a quiet triumph. Days began to flow, not in isolation, but in purpose. His body grew lean and strong, his senses sharpened. He could tell the hour by the way the shadows shifted on the cliffs, or forecast a storm by the sudden silence of birds. And with the work came something quieter, deeper, a sense of contentment. He was not lost. He was rooted. The island no longer felt like a prison. It had become a companion, wild and stubborn, yes, but one he had come to know intimately. Where others might have gone mad in the silence, Selkirk found steadiness. Through the hard work of building, hunting, and listening, he carved a life that was not merely endured, but owned. Time, in the world Selkirk had left behind, was measured in bells, calendars, and the turning of tides driven by human need. But here, alone on Masa Tierra, time softened. It slipped its edges, became slower, rounder, a rhythm guided by the land, the seasons, and the quiet unfolding of each new day. As the first year passed into the second, Selkirk no longer marked days with notches or tracked weeks with care. He lived by signs in the natural world, the flowering of a certain tree, the return of nesting birds, the thinning of the goats' coats before the rains. The island had become his calendar, and he read it not with urgency, but with quiet familiarity. There were long, golden months of calm, when the skies remained clear and the seas lay still, like glass cradling the edge of the world. These were times of plenty, when the goats were easy to track, the berries ripe, and his shelters dry and warm. He would wake with the sun and climb to his lookout on a high ridge, sitting with his back against the stone, watching the horizon. He still hoped for sails, but no longer longed for them. Then came the wet seasons, where thick rains rolled over the island in sheets, drumming softly on palm thatch and turning the paths to ribbons of mud. During those months, he stayed nearer his huts, repairing tools and mending garments. He knew much of it by heart now, and the sound of his own voice, steady and low, became as much a part of the island as the winds or the trees. There were times, too, when solitude pressed heavier, not with panic, but with a deep, aching quiet. Birthdays came and went without remark. Dreams of family flickered in sleep, only to fade with the morning mist. But in those moments, Selkirk turned not to despair, but to routine. The act of doing, building, hunting, preparing, gave shape to days that might otherwise have been lost. He spoke less, even to himself, but he listened more, to the rustle of wind through leaves, to the clatter of stones disturbed by distant hooves, to the low thrum of his own heartbeat when he sat still. In the absence of conversation, he had come to understand something rare, the sound of his own mind settling into peace. There was no audience, no judgment, no one to impress or disappoint. And so, in this space between memory and survival, Selkirk began to reshape himself, less defined by the man he had been at sea, and more by the man he had become on land. The island, wild and indifferent, had not broken him, it had refined him. Years passed this way, quiet and steady. Hair grew long, skin darkened by sun and salt. His hands, once calloused from rope, now bore the marks of stone, bark, and hide, and his soul, once restless and raw, had settled into something slower, something durable. He had become, in every way that mattered, a part of the island. Not its master, but its companion. It was a warm afternoon when Selkirk first saw them. Sails, pale and ghost-like, drifting along the horizon. They seemed impossibly far off, and for a moment he thought they might be clouds. But no. The shape, was too clean, too deliberate. His heart stirred with sudden urgency. He scrambled from his hillside perch, heart racing, legs sure-footed from years of climbing these paths. Down to the shore he ran, arms waving, calling out into the wide, indifferent air. He lit a fire with trembling hands, feeding it dry brush and palm fronds, until the smoke rose high and dark. But the ship never turned. Whether they hadn't seen him or had chosen not to investigate, he would never know. The sails faded westward, leaving nothing behind but the whisper of possibility. He stood long after they were gone, the smoke of his signal fire curling lazily into the afternoon sky. Then, slowly, he returned to the hills, not in despair, but with a quiet sort of acceptance. It happened again and again. On 3, perhaps 4, separate occasions over the years, Selkirk spotted passing ships. Sometimes they were distant and ghost-like, barely more than a glint against the sea. Other times they were closer, enough that he could make out the sweep of the hull, the flutter of rigging. He always tried, always signaled. Fires were built, bright and tall. He shouted, waved garments from the cliffs, sent his hopes arcing like arrows across the water. But no ship ever came for him. One of them, he later suspected, may have been Spanish, and had they seen him, they might not have rescued him at all. A Scottish privateer, marooned or not, would not have found mercy in the hands of Spain. He knew enough of war and its politics to understand that sometimes being seen could be more dangerous than being forgotten. So he continued to wait, not idly, but with a practiced patience. The hope of rescue remained, not as a desperate longing, but as a quiet thread woven through his days. He did not let it rule him. He lived as if no ship would ever come. But still, he watched the sea, and it watched him back. Each vanishing sail left behind a stillness that stretched for days, but the island, ever impartial, offered no comfort nor judgment, just the soft return of routine, tending to the goats, repairing the roof, foraging near the shore. Hope, on the island, had learned to be silent. It did not shout any more. It whispered like the wind in the grass, constant but calm. Selkirk, too, had changed. His longing for rescue no longer came from fear of the island, but from a deep curiosity. What remained out there? What had become of the world he'd left, of Lower Largo, of the men who had once sailed with him? The answers drifted always just beyond the horizon. It had been years since he had last heard another human voice. Years of solitude, of quiet days among the goats and pepper trees, of firelight prayers spoken into the hush of evening. The island had become a companion, a place of peace, but also of vigilance. And one morning, as he walked along a narrow path he knew well, something shifted. In the soft earth near a stream, he saw them. Footprints, not his. The shape was unmistakable, the deep heel, the deliberate press of toes, larger than his own and newer than the morning's dew. Selkirk froze, the old instincts of caution and alertness stirring to life once more. His solitude, which had for so long been unbroken, was now pierced by something unknown. He crouched low, listening. The forest gave nothing away. Birds still sang, the leaves still rustled. But the stillness now held tension, like the breath before a storm. He backtracked quickly, moving with silent steps up to a familiar ridge. There, he concealed himself beneath low branches and scanned the coastline. Below, on a rocky cove, he saw them. A group of men, 4, maybe 5, unloading a boat. They bore weapons. Their speech, carried faintly on the wind, was not English. They were Spanish. Whether they had come to gather fresh water or to scout the island, Selkirk could not say, but he knew their kind. Spanish ships still patrolled these waters, and privateers like himself were considered little more than pirates. If he were discovered, he would not be treated as a castaway. He would be taken, or worse. So, quietly and carefully, Selkirk vanished deeper into the island's heart. He had spent the last few years taming this land. Now he used that knowledge to hide within it. He knew which paths were softest underfoot, which caves would muffle sound, which trees could conceal the smoke of a small, hidden fire. He moved only at night, slept in different spots, and left no trace behind. The island that had once held him had now become his refuge, and this time not from loneliness, but from danger. The Spaniards did not stay long. After a few days, they left, whether satisfied or uneasy. Selkirk never learned, but even after their sails slipped beneath the horizon, the memory lingered. The knowledge that he was not as forgotten as he had once believed. He became more cautious in the months that followed. The wildness of the island returned a little, not in its physical form, but in his thoughts. He had known peace. Now he remembered caution. Not fear exactly, but a sharpening of the senses. The island had always watched him. Now he watched it too. Still, the solitude returned in time. The echo of foreign voices faded, and once again the rhythm of the land became steady. But Selkirk had been reminded. The world had not disappeared. It was still out there, vast and unpredictable. And though he remained alone, he was not untouched by its presence. It was in the early months of 1709, more than 4 years since Selkirk had been left behind, when the sails appeared once more on the horizon. He saw them from his ridge, where he often sat in quiet reflection. At first, he squinted into the distance, uncertain if it was a ship or just the sea playing tricks again. But as the form drew closer, he stood. There was something different this time, a steadiness in the course, a shape that held. It was no mirage. And so, as he had before, he raced down the hillside. His legs were strong now, goat-like in their balance. He knew every stone, every root beneath the soil. At the shoreline, he struck flint to tinder and built his fire high. Black smoke curled into the sky, bold and unmistakable. The ship responded. Anchors were dropped. A boat was lowered. The men who stepped ashore that day were English, from a privateering vessel named the Duke, under the command of Woodes Rogers. They came ashore wary, expecting perhaps to find wreckage or an ambush. But instead, they found a man dressed in goatskins, darkened by sun and wind, his beard long and eyes sharp. He greeted them in English, though his voice trembled with disuse. It must have seemed to them a ghost from another world, but Selkirk was real, quiet, composed, though deeply moved. They listened, astonished, as he told his story, how he had lived alone on the island for 4 years, surviving on goats and wild roots, building shelters, crafting tools, keeping time not by calendars, but by the growth of trees and the arc of the stars. The crew of the Duke welcomed him aboard with awe and respect. Rogers, in his journal, would later describe Selkirk as a man clothed in goatskins who spoke with a sense and temper uncommon among sailors. In truth, he had changed. He spoke gently, sparingly. His manner had the calm of someone who no longer feared silence. He moved easily about the ship, but seemed almost to glide, as if still walking among ferns and stone, rather than pitch and deck. As the ship pulled away from the island, the only home he had known for years, Selkirk stood at the rail, watching it recede. There was no cheer, no cry of triumph, just the wind in his hair, the salty scent of sea air, and a long, quiet breath. His return to the world was gradual. He served as a navigator aboard the Duke, his skills still sharp, perhaps even sharpened by the discipline of solitude. He guided them with quiet confidence, earning the respect of officers and crew alike. In the weeks that followed, he slowly began to reacquaint himself with conversation, companionship, and the strange noise of society. But something of the island remained in him, a stillness, a steadiness. He had been alone, yes, but never undone. And now, at long last, the horizon no longer held him captive. It moved beneath him once more, wide and open, a path not of exile, but of return. Alexander Selkirk returned to Britain not as a celebrity, but as a curiosity, a quiet man with a quiet tale, told in low tones to those who would listen. His story spread in taverns and seaports, in pamphlets, and among naval men. A sailor marooned for years on a deserted island, surviving through patience and calm endurance. He had no flair for dramatics, no interest in selling his tale, and yet it took on a life of its own. Writers began to retell the story, each version embroidered a little more than the last. The solitude deepened, the dangers grew sharper, the man grew taller in recollection than he ever stood in life. But even as the tale passed from hand to hand, there remained a core of truth that no fiction could fully disguise. In 1719, 10 years after the rescue, a writer named Daniel Defoe published a novel titled Robinson Crusoe. It bore striking resemblance to the castaway's true ordeal, though shaded with invention. The character stayed nearly 3 decades alone, built fortresses in the wild, and fought off hostile visitors. It was a tale shaped more for thrill than for truth. Still, at its quiet center was something unmistakable. The soul of a man reshaped by silence, strengthened by solitude. The seed of the story had been planted on that distant island, where endurance had grown not from spectacle, but from simplicity. Defoe had drawn deeply, whether knowingly or not, from the life of Alexander Selkirk. Back in Scotland, the returning sailor found it difficult to readjust. He walked the streets of Lower Largo once more, but the lanes felt narrower, the voices more distant. The village had changed. Or perhaps it was he who had changed. Eventually, he took to the sea again, not as a lost man, but as one with knowledge few others possessed. He served in the Royal Navy with quiet confidence, no longer chasing anything, only fulfilling what remained of the life the ocean had left him. He served quietly, respectably, but the island had marked him. Those who met him in later years noted something steady in his presence, a stillness behind his eyes, not haunted, not broken, just aware. A man who had known what it was to live without time, without voice, and who had returned with something stronger than fame. In 1721, while aboard HMS Weymouth off the coast of West Africa, Selkirk died of yellow fever. He was buried at sea, the waves folding over him one last time. No monument marked the spot, no grand farewell, just the hush of water and the rhythm of tide. And yet, in the centuries since, his story has endured. He is remembered not just as the man who inspired a novel, but as a figure of quiet fortitude, someone who met the harshest kind of solitude, not with despair, but with calm invention. A man who built a world from almost nothing and who left it, not by rescue, but by readiness. His island, now called Robinson Crusoe Island, still rises from the Pacific, windswept and green, silent under the stars. And somewhere in that silence, the memory of Alexander Selkirk still lingers. Not loud, not demanding, but steady as stone and soft as sleep. That's all for tonight's journey through history. Whether you're fast asleep or still drifting there, thank you for listening. Until next time, rest well.